Hi there and welcome back. I have to say, studying the names of God with you this year has just been so enriching. And it's interesting because what we've seen so far in the past few months are kind of these big, awe-inspiring terms of God. Mighty God, Creator, Everlasting, Healer. We hear these things and they just seem big, and we get the idea of this grandeur of our God. And this week we take a little bit different turn because now we're talking about God's name as child, which when you hear the word child feels so different than hearing mighty God. It all of a sudden brings things down to a smaller place and something that doesn't feel maybe as grandiose or awe-inspiring. But as we kind of dive into this lesson today, I'm hoping that the name of child will be awe-inspiring in a new and fresh way to you. So I want to start with what was one of our key verses in our lesson this week with Isaiah 9:6. Now this is a verse that we hear all the time this time of year, but we hear it on its own. And so we're going to talk a little bit about where the context is happening and what's going on in the book of Isaiah. So Isaiah 9:6, which probably most of us can quote from memory, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." So it's interesting because we get these big, awe-inspiring terms at the end of the verse, but we start out talking about a child being born. So what's happening in the book of Isaiah here is Isaiah is a prophet in the southern kingdom of Judah. And at the time, there is all kinds of political and military upheaval and unrest. What's happening is Israel and Syria are inviting Judah to form an alliance with them against the superpower of Assyria. Assyria was massive. They were brutal. They were known for their military tactics. They were known for their harshness, and everyone was afraid of them. Well, instead, King Ahaz, who was so afraid of Assyria, decided to go to Assyria himself and try to buy his way out of an invasion. He sends a tribute or kind of a ransom money to the king of Assyria, basically saying, hey, don't attack us. We're on your side. So what happens is Isaiah is prophesying to the people of Judah, to the kings, talking about what's going to happen. So if we jump back a chapter into Isaiah 8, starting at verse 7, "Therefore the Lord is about to bring against them the mighty floodwaters of the Euphrates. The king of Assyria with all his pomp, it will overflow all its channels, run over all its banks, and sweep on into Judah, swirling over it, passing through it and reaching up to the neck. Its outspread wings will cover the breadth of your land. Emmanuel, raise the war cry, you nations, and be shattered. Listen, all you distant lands, prepare for battle and be shattered. Prepare for battle and be shattered." Isaiah is saying destruction is coming. And there's this fear and despair happening with all of this political and military unrest. And the people are afraid and the king is afraid. And then we come to chapter 9. At the beginning of the chapter, "Nevertheless," remember he has just said Judah's going to be wiped out, shattered. "Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire." That verse that last verse, verse 5, means battle is done. They can burn their war garments. They can burn their sandals. They're done. Victory is complete. So we've come off this prophecy in chapter 8 of you're going to get wiped out. Nevertheless, light will come into the darkness. There will be victory. The people will rejoice. And that's where he says in verse 6, for unto us a child is born, a son is given. Now we know that that verse is a prophecy of the Messiah to come. And so even though that this chapter about hope and light is not coming in their time, it is coming, and it's coming in a way that will last forever. And so, that's just one little side note we need to look at, is that sometimes when our circumstances seem dark and desperate, we may not get the answer we're searching for. We may not get the circumstances fixed or fixed the way that we want, but there is always hope. Light will always overcome the darkness, and we may not see it in our present circumstance, but it is the future hope that we have. So even though these people at this time still got wiped out, they still suffered greatly at the hands of their enemies, there was a future hope that Isaiah talked about that would conquer in the end. And so we need to remember that too. So what I want to look at is, why a child? Why didn't Jesus just appear on the scene as a full-grown adult? Just dive into his ministry, start out teaching, preaching, come and do what he came for, to teach, to be crucified. Why a child? There's so many reasons, and we're just going to talk about a few. So one of the most important is to fulfill a prophecy. Over and over in the Old Testament, God is giving promises to his people about descendants, offspring, seed. These are words we see over and over again. It's talked about in Genesis 3. After Eve and Adam sin in the garden, God is saying to the serpent, in 3:15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring of the serpent, and her offspring. He will crush your head. You will strike his heel. It's a prophecy of the one to come. In Genesis 17, God is telling Abraham, I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you. Genesis 49:10, blessing that's being spoken over Judah specifically. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nation shall be his. He's saying the kingdom will belong in Judah's line forever. And then to David in 2 Samuel 7, when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So God is saying there is one coming from the line of David, from Judah, from Abraham, their kingdom will last forever. So if Jesus is going to fulfill this promise about being a descendant, he had to be born. He had to be an offspring of these people. And we see in the genealogy in the beginning of Matthew how he fulfills just that, how he comes from these lines that were promised from ages past. He had to be born and be an offspring and a descendant in order to fulfill those prophecies. Another thing is to be accessible. We are naturally drawn to children. You are probably not very often around a baby that it's like a magnet. You're just sucked right in, right? You want to make them smile, or you want to smell their head or touch their soft skin. There's something about a baby and about children that naturally draw us in. They are not intimidating. They don't have power. They don't have rank or anything that would put us off. They're lowly, they're helpless, they're dependent, and so it makes them accessible to us. when we see in Luke 2 how the angels came to the shepherds, and the shepherds with great joy went to go see the baby in the manger. Had the angels come to the shepherds, who were the lowest of the low, and said, hey, there is a new mighty king sitting on his throne, go visit, I don't think they would have felt like they could have. But a baby in a manger in a stable, that they could do. He was accessible to everyone. Another thing is that children bring joy. And Jesus brought joy as a baby. Again, there's just kind of this natural drawing to them. There's nothing better than a baby's giggle or a baby's smile. They just bring so much joy. There was a time many years ago in our family, and my husband's uncle was passing away. He was on hospice and they had him at home. And so the family would often gather in the home, and in one room where he was in his hospital bed, there'd be people talking and praying and singing. And in the other room, family that was taking a break or just visiting with each other would be hanging out. Well, at the time, my oldest son was 9 months old. And so in this room, that was not the room with the hospital bed, there was laughter and there was joy, because the 9-month-old baby, he's happy, he's smiling, he's crawling, he's playing. And people in the family often still say that he brought a lot of joy during a difficult family time, because babies do that. They bring joy. And what I love about this is that before Jesus was capable of doing anything else, his presence brought joy. He couldn't offer anything. He couldn't do anything for anyone, but simply his presence was a gift and brought joy. Another thing is to set an example. Jesus talks to his followers about having the faith of a child and the trust of a child. In Matthew 18, he talks about, unless you become like a child, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And so he's able to show welcome to children because he was one himself. He's able to show this humility of children and say, you can't enter the kingdom unless you become like a child. And he could say that because he'd been one himself. Had he shown up as an adult, had he not experienced life or suffering or grief or temptation, we wouldn't trust him the same way. But he can set an example because he lived on earth from birth to death, and then of course resurrected life. And so we know, he knows. He lived a full life on earth, so he can set an example for us. And when he speaks these words, we can listen because he's been there. Along those same lines is to show humility. Jesus, in becoming man, had to show the greatest amount of humility. We're pretty familiar with Philippians 2, where it talks about how Jesus emptied himself. He got rid of all the privileges and the rights of heaven, became nothing, became in human likeness. Humility. What's more humble than a child? What's more least of these than a child? And Jesus is often telling his followers, if you want to be great, you have to be the servant. He says that in Matthew 20. He says that in Luke 9. If you want to be great, you have to become least, like a child. You have to become a servant. And so Jesus demonstrated that by his own life, showing humility, showing being the least of these as something that was of high value. Finally, I just want to look at this idea of the importance of Jesus becoming a child for this reason. So there's a couple quotes by C.S. Lewis, and one, there's this essay that he wrote called The Seeing Eye, and he's responding to the fact that at the time the Russians had gone up into space and came back and they said, we didn't find God. And so C.S. Lewis says, the Russians, I am told, report that they have not found God in outer space. Looking for God or heaven by exploring space is like reading or seeing all Shakespeare's plays in the hope that you will find Shakespeare as one of the characters. Shakespeare is, in one sense, present at every moment in every play, but he's never present the same way as Lady Macbeth. So he's saying you can't just go to another place and expect to find God when God authored the whole thing. And then in his book, Surprised by Joy, he talks about how he thought that God was just orchestrating a play like Shakespeare, and that he says, I could no more meet him than Hamlet could meet Shakespeare. If Shakespeare and Hamlet could ever meet, it must be Shakespeare's doing. Hamlet could initiate nothing. In other words, there's an author of the story, and he's very present everywhere we look. But the only way to really know the author of the story is if the author writes himself into the story. And that's what happens when Jesus comes to earth as a baby. He has written himself into the story. No longer just an author who has created and orchestrated, but written himself straight in so that the characters in the story could actually meet him face to face. The same way that Hamlet could never know Shakespeare unless Shakespeare wrote himself into the story, God writes himself into our story, comes right into the middle of the mess, into the ordinary, into a family, into a community in the most humble and helpless way. That's how we get to know him. It's this word called incarnation, and it's the incarnation that we celebrate this time of year. If we look back at Isaiah 9:6, it says, a child is born. That means he was fully man. And we see a son is given. He was fully God, which should help us think about John 3:16. Dr. David Jeremiah says, if he had been God only, his sacrifice would have been cheap and unconvincing. If he had been man only, his sacrifice would have had no power. He would have been a martyr like 10,000 others. He had to be both God and man. So as we look about how Jesus fulfilled every prophecy, he was a descendant of David, of Judah, came through the line to establish a kingdom that would last forever. He was accessible to all because of his helpless, lowly state. Everyone could approach him, not as a mighty king sitting on a throne, but a helpless baby in humble circumstances. He brought joy. He brought the gift of his very presence before there was a thing he could offer to us. The incarnation is truly remarkable and awe-inspiring. And it can be kind of easy to take this verse from Isaiah or the baby Jesus for granted at this time of year, and for the word child as a name of God to feel somehow less than mighty God or everlasting or healer. But as we look at how Jesus emptied himself and took the form of a helpless child so that he might be accessible to us, so that he might write himself into our story and be the perfect sacrifice, the only way to God, I hope that makes the word child and the baby Jesus seem even more awe-inspiring in a fresh new way for you this year. God bless you.